Welcome back, guys. This is going to be kind of an additional section for our unit on evolution. We've talked about where the idea of evolution came from. We've talked about evidence for it. We've talked about it in action. We've watched a documentary now that's kind of detailed the history of species evolving on Earth and Earth's history. The only thing left to really do, and the only thing that the documentary that we watched didn't really touch on a lot, was the origin of life. Where did it actually come from? And so this is going to be a presentation that's going to kind of show you what we think is our best guess. So that's what we got here. Okay, so just kind of backing up, before the Earth, before our solar system, everything came from something, right? It had to come from somewhere. And so the Big Bang, I know this app has changed up our font and formatting, so I apologize, it's a little messy here. But once everything was in space, was contained in, everything at one point in time was contained in an infinitely dense area. There was just a single point, right? Oops, so let me change it to a color you can see clearly. It was just a single point. Everything was in this point. And so that point is actually called singularity, where everything, all matter that ever existed, is in this one point. And then suddenly, that point started to expand very, very quickly, and that's the idea here of this Big Bang. That all matter and energy were hurled into space, basically really, really fast, very quickly moving apart. This happened, it says here, 15 billion years ago. I think a more accurate number, if I remember correctly, was something like 14 and a half. If you see BYA, that's billions of years ago. Somewhere in that range. It might be 14.7. But that's about how long ago this occurred. And if you remember from the video on the history of the solar system and the Earth, our solar system is about 5 billion years old. And the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old, billions of years ago. So it gives you kind of an idea. Our solar system's only been around for about a third or so of the universe's existence. How do we know this? Well, telescopic data, we can figure out the universe is expanding, the rate at which it was expanding, and if you know how fast it's expanding, you can work your way backwards to figure out how long ago did it actually start. And so that was started by a guy, Edwin Hubble. That's named the Hubble telescope was named after. Okay, there are other theories out there, but this one has the most evidence for it. Okay, so where does all this come from? You have this Big Bang that ejects matter out into the universe, matter in the space that matter is confined in, and it's basically so hot. Okay, this matter comes out and it's incredibly hot, and it's moving very fast. And for much of the beginning of the universe existence, things were so hot and they were moving so fast that they would not stick together, that things were just basically flying apart. As the universe expands, it does start to cool down, so things start to cool, particles start to move a little bit slower, and as things move slower, the force here, gravity, can start allowing stuff to stick together. So it causes the matter to come together and form the galaxies and stars. So all that gas, the first elements, by the way, there was hydrogen, a little bit of helium, and just a tiny, tiny bit of lithium in the early universe. Most of it was hydrogen. And so this stuff starts to stick together. The gas starts to come together. We get these initial stars. The stars go through their entire lifetimes, and as stars die, they produce heavier elements. Basically, the first 26 elements up through iron are made in the cores of stars. Everything after iron, so that's element 26, everything 27 and onward is made in a supernova, which is when the star explodes. But that's how we get all the heavier elements. So anyway, so everything starts as hydrogen. So that's how these stars started. Gravitational fields cause the formation of planets and the moon. So as these things start going supernova and making heavier elements like carbon and oxygen, okay, all the oxygen you're breathing in is at one point made in a star. That's where it had to have come from. But gravity's causing all this stuff to stick together, right? You start getting rocks elements react with each other, things stick together, and we wind up with planets forming, as you saw in that video in the history of the Earth. So Earth's about 4.5 billion years old or so. Early Earth, if you remember from that video, hellish skies, volcanic eruptions, insanely hot temperatures. Basically, any atmosphere that was there was poisonous. Asteroids and comets are basically hitting it continuously. The ground is basically molten lava. So for the first half a billion years or so, Earth is pretty uninhabitable. There's no ozone. The atmosphere had hydrogen cyanide, which, I apologize, my dog might start barking in the background here. Hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen gas. This is hydrogen sulfide. Okay, and then there's some water vapor. Basically, everything was straight poison. There's no oxygen gas, so you couldn't breathe anything in. And it's basically being bombarded by radiation that's not good for you. Cosmic rays, then you got lightning strikes, other types of radiation, since there's no atmosphere to protect you, so that's bad. So the heavier stuff, even though this is a ball of molten magma, basically, but the heavier stuff starts to sink to the core, and its Earth's core is now molten iron, with some other stuff, but largely molten iron. And it's now surrounded by hot liquid. The planet starts to cool, and the outside layer of it turns into a crust. The inside is still liquid, but the outside is a crust. And then there are gases released as these things cool as well. So about 4 billion years ago or so, the Earth finally cools to the point where you have rocks on the surface. Okay, so it took about 500 million years for it to just cool down. And then it took about 200 million years or so for it to cool enough where water actually could form, liquid water. So that was about 3.8 billions of years ago. Oceans were basically brown because of the amount of dissolved iron. It wasn't like pretty blue waters or anything like that, but they finally had some water on the surface, which you did see in that video as well. So how does life actually start in all of this? So some ideas here put forward right, is that inorganic materials evolved into organic compounds. Well, we're talking about something that's non-living suddenly living, evolving into organic compounds. That may not be very likely. Created by a supernatural force or a deity, as much as we believe in this from what you read in the Bible and in Genesis. There's no scientific evidence. It's not like, God left us a giant tablet forever that we can all look at and says, this is where man started, right? And we saw him put it there, and there's, evidence that he put it there. That's not there. It doesn't exist like that. So we're trying to find, what's actually there, what's really there. Doesn't mean he didn't create it. It just means there's not scientific basis for it. Life originated elsewhere and was transported here. So, I don't know, maybe the more conspiracy theorist among you might believe something like that it started elsewhere and it was put on Earth. And then our last option here is life evolves from non-living matter by interactions between natural, geologic, and astronomical environments. Complex chemical evolution causes biological evolution. So things start as chemicals and somehow they form life. Okay? And this is the option that we're going to look at closer here is there a way to go from being just chemicals to life, right, on their own? What could have done this? So that's what we're going to look at. And there's actually some evidence for this. Two guys, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. This experiment is called the Miller-Urey experiment. Okay, this one's pretty famous in the world of biology. So these two scientists, what they're going to do, here's their device. They performed an experiment that tried to simulate early conditions on Earth. So, what was the atmosphere actually like? What was going on? And to see what would happen with the chemicals involved. The experiment produced organic compounds. They made amino acids. The first experiment was believed to be flawed because ammonia and methane were not believed to be in the early atmosphere, even though they were including it in their setup. But later experiments representing early atmosphere more accurately still managed to produce organic material. So even when they took out this ammonia and methane, they were still able to make amino acids, which, if you remember, are the building blocks of proteins. So we have the pieces of proteins just by looking at the chemicals in Earth's early atmosphere. And even more crazy here, in 1995, they were able to make cytosine and uracil by just running this experiment. So two bases that are found in RNA. So they were able to make components of RNA and the components of proteins simply by trying to simulate Earth's early atmosphere. So what was going on here, trying to explain this to you, they have a flask of water they're heating up. So that's going to boil off into water vapor. It's going to come up here, and they're mixing in gases from the early Earth. We know what gases there were. We have evidence of that. We know what would have been there. So we can mix those two together. Right? So this is hot. This is quite warm. Steam. Mixing in with early gases coming over here. They basically run an electric current through here. Okay, they're like, well, maybe that's like the lightning storms early on Earth. If you remember from the video, there was some talk about how the early Earth had some crazy strong storms. So maybe that some lightning mixed in with the atmosphere and a little bit of moisture. They let this cool down, and they collect the water. And in the water here, they would take some drops out of the bottom as this stuff started to settle. They would find those organic compounds, right? The proteins, and in this case, down here, cytosine and uracil. So all this was trying to simulate Earth's early atmosphere, and we were able to successfully make some of the key components, okay, of life. So this is called the Miller-Urey experiment. Pretty famous. So a few organic molecules are a long way from life. Just because we can make, some amino acids and a couple of bases of RNA, doesn't mean that we've made life or that it necessarily immediately became life. But amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins form many of the structures in cells and organisms. So you can make a wide variety of amino acids. Maybe proteins can start forming. And we know that RNA and DNA must play a role in this somewhere in life, right? Because all living things share DNA and RNA. Okay, so we know that has to come in somewhere, but all we were making was RNA. In a human and other organisms, DNA is used to synthesize RNA, which means it must have come first, right? If we're using DNA to make RNA, wouldn't this have had to have come first? But did it? There's some confusion here because RNA is more simple, right? It's a single strand, okay, versus, whoops, why is it doing like that? It's a single strand versus like DNA, which is that double-stranded, right, helix. So how is this, whoops, not what I want to do, how is this RNA, single-stranded RNA, coming along after this double-stranded DNA? It would make sense to build up from the simplest ones to the more complex ones. But Scripps Institute and others now believe that RNA is the master molecule. It has the ability to sequence amino acids into proteins and can help DNA replicate and can grow and duplicate itself. So there's actually some evidence that this might have come first, even though, like, logically, from what we've seen so far, well, maybe it must have been DNA. Well, maybe it was actually RNA. Okay, so where do cells come from? So this idea of microspheres, this is large organic molecules that form tiny bubbles called proteinoid microspheres. If you remember from first semester, I'm going to draw a structure here, right? Hopefully what I'm drawing looks familiar to you, right? These are phospholipids, yeah? Okay, and these make up cell membranes. Well, if we could, say, make a bunch of phospholipids, that would have been made, say, during the Earth's early atmosphere. A cool thing about phospholipids is that if you just put phospholipids into water, they will spontaneously arrange themselves into a bilayer. They do this on their own. Okay? And they'll do the whole circle of this as well. They'll go all the way around. And so this is how we end up with these tiny spheres. So perhaps, right, we've got these phospholipids that could have potentially been made as well, that encapsulate a couple of proteins, right, or whatever else might have been caught in here at the time, some DNA or RNA. and you have sort of the idea of a cell, right? It's an extremely simple cell that perhaps these phospholipids have encapsulated some amino acids and some RNA, and maybe that was enough. So combining these spheres with proteins, RNA, and DNA, and you'd have living cells. Now, I mean, we got a long way to go, right? We've got some other structures like ribosomes that need to get made. We need, a full DNA molecule as well, some RNA. So there's still more to come here, but we have a basic cell, the idea of a cell. Okay, so about 200 to 300 million years after water starts to form on Earth, so we're talking about 3.5 billion years ago, evidence suggests the presence of microfossils. So we'll see these tiny prokaryotic organisms that resemble bacteria, modern bacteria. So this is about 3.5 billion years ago is the first life. So Earth's about 4.5, life's about 3.5 billion years old. These early organisms would had to have been able to perform photosynthesis. Okay, they'd have to make their own food, right? They're not going to be able to survive off of trying to eat other organisms because there aren't any. So these early organisms would have had to have been able to produce their own energy, either through photosynthesis or some other way to do it, chemosynthesis, something. Okay, and one of the byproducts of this was putting free oxygen into the atmosphere. You might remember those structures in the documentary that were underwater. They were basically giant bacterial colonies that were just under the surface there, and they were producing a lot of oxygen, which would be the oxygen in our atmosphere today. So what would that do? Well, it would combine with iron in the oceans to form iron oxide. That would all sink to the bottom of the ocean, and this would finally clear up that water from being that brown, red color water into the blue-green color that we know it is today. Oxygen starts to accumulate in the atmosphere, and some of it turns into ozone. By the way, oxygen gas, this formula is, let's change my color of the pen here, is O2. Ozone is O3. 3 oxygens bonded together. So some of this sometimes turns into ozone. Concentrations of methane and hydrogen sulfide go down. When you have less volcanic action going on, we have less methane being released and less hydrogen sulfide. So the atmosphere becomes more breathable. And we're going to get a mass extinction of too many life forms on the planet with this extra oxygen. Like, we're changing the planet so much that if something wasn't adapted to this, it likely wasn't going to stay around for a while. Okay, some other early theories is that heterotrophs could not have been the first organisms to develop because the food supply would have been finite. Right? They would have eaten all the food and then they would have been extinct. Autotrophs can produce their own food by means of photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and a byproduct of this is oxygen gas. This would explain the production of free oxygen, which was not present in the Earth's early atmosphere. So where did all the oxygen in our planet come from? This early photosynthetic bacteria. It had to have been where it came from. Prokaryotes, which are simple-celled, single-celled organisms, would lead to eukaryotic cells that can be found as single or multicellular. And we've already talked about the idea of the endosymbiotic theory from first semester, that these two things, something like a mitochondria and a chloroplast, thought they might have been early prokaryotes, were then incorporated into these eukaryotic cells, right? Because they have their own DNA separate from the rest of the cell. So that was that endosymbiotic theory from first semester. Okay, and it's just the last bit of slide here. The development has led to huge jumps in evolution because of greater genetic variation because of DNA mutations when we're talking about sexual reproduction. So a wide variety of genetic variation. Single-celled organisms reproduce by asexual means, which restricts genetic variation and slows the process of evolution. So as soon as sexual reproduction is introduced as a means of reproducing, evolution could speed up quite a bit. This is telling you that if you're reproducing asexually, where every single thing is identical to what came before it, well, you're not going to evolve very quickly. So this introduction of sexual reproduction quickly accelerated variation and mutations and evolution.